Game of English with Luke Donovan. Matrix verb system. Perfect continuous. I'd been driving, you'd been driving, he'd been driving, she'd been driving, it had been driving, we'd been driving, you'd been driving, they'd been driving. I've been driving, you've been driving, he's been driving, she's been driving, it's been driving, we've been driving, you've been driving, they've been driving. I'll have been driving, you'll have been driving, he'll have been driving, she'll have been driving, it'll have been driving, we'll have been driving, you'll have been driving, they'll have been driving. I hadn't been driving, you hadn't been driving, he hadn't been driving, she hadn't been driving, it hadn't been driving, we hadn't been driving, you hadn't been driving, they hadn't been driving. I haven't been driving, you haven't been driving, he hasn't been driving, she hasn't been driving, it hasn't been driving, we haven't been driving, you haven't been driving, they haven't been driving. I won't have been driving, you won't have been driving, he won't have been driving, she won't have been driving, it won't have been driving, we won't have been driving, you won't have been driving, they won't have been driving. Had I been driving? Had you been driving? Had he been driving? Had she been driving? Had it been driving? Had we been driving? Had you been driving? Had they been driving? Have I been driving? Have you been driving? Has he been driving? Has she been driving? Has it been driving? Have we been driving? Have you been driving? Have they been driving? Will I have been driving? Will you have been driving? Will he have been driving? Will she have been driving? Will it have been driving? Will we have been driving? Will you have been driving? Will they have been driving? Hadn't I been driving? Hadn't you been driving? Hadn't he been driving? Hadn't she been driving? Hadn't it been driving? Hadn't we been driving? Hadn't you been driving? Hadn't they been driving? Haven't I been driving? Haven't you been driving? Hasn't he been driving? Hasn't she been driving? Hasn't it been driving? Haven't we been driving? Haven't you been driving? Haven't they been driving? Won't I have been driving? Won't you have been driving? Won't he have been driving? Won't she have been driving? Won't it have been driving? Won't we have been driving? Won't you have been driving? Won't they have been driving?
Created using Powtoon.